Imagine finding out that the judge in charge of fighting corruption in your country was secretly texting the criminal he was supposed to be locking up. Now imagine that judge also had a wife who received $28 million from that same criminal. And now imagine that when the press exposed all of this, the judge tried to deny it on national television and got caught lying live. That is not a Netflix series. That is Brazil right now in 2025. Stay with me. Because this story goes deeper than anything you've ever heard about political corruption, and it involves one of the most powerful men in the entire Western Hemisphere. Before we start, let me give you a 60-second crash course on Brazil, because this story will not make sense without it. Brazil is the largest country in South America, population of 215 million people, the world's 8th largest economy. It has a Supreme Court called the STF, Supremo Tribunal Federal, which functions very similarly to the US Supreme Court. 11 justices, lifetime appointments, enormous power. Now here's where it gets interesting. Brazil's Supreme Court, in recent years, took on a role that goes far beyond what most Supreme Courts do. After years of political chaos, including a president who questioned election results, social media battles, and what many called an information war, the STF took it upon itself to become the guardian of Brazilian democracy. One justice in particular became the symbol of this new power. His name is Alexandre de Moraes. And in Brazil, you either love him or you're terrified of him. There is no middle ground. He has ordered the arrest of politicians, blocked social media platforms, censored journalists, and led investigations into what he called fake news militias and anti-democratic movements. To his supporters, he was Batman, the protector of democracy. The one man willing to stand up to the powerful. To his critics, he was the most dangerous, unelected official in Latin America. A judge who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. And then, in early 2025, a banking scandal that started with fraud and money changed everything, because it revealed that Alexandre de Moraes may not have been Batman at all. He may have been the villain, the bank nobody had heard of. Let's start at the beginning. Banco Master. Most Brazilians had never heard of it. It wasn't one of the big banks like Itaú, Bradesco, or Santander. It was a mid-sized bank, what Brazilians call a Banco de Medio Porte. Not small, not huge. But Banco Master was growing fast, suspiciously fast, and it was growing by offering something that attracted hundreds of thousands of ordinary Brazilians. Incredibly high interest rates on investments. Higher than the big banks. Higher than what was mathematically sustainable. If you know anything about finance, you're already thinking Ponzi scheme, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. The rotten assets. How the fraud worked, here's what investigators found. Banco Master wasn't actually investing the money it received. It was filling its balance sheet with what financial experts call toxic assets, or rotten assets. Essentially, investments that looked good on paper, but were worth almost nothing in reality. Think of it like this. Imagine you open a store. Customers give you money. Instead of buying inventory to sell, you fill your warehouse with counterfeit products and faked receipts. From the outside, the store looks successful. The books look healthy, but if anyone looks inside the warehouse, it all falls apart. That's Banco Master. And when Brazilian financial regulators, the Banco Central, started looking inside that warehouse in 2024 and 2025, what they found was catastrophic. The bank was insolvent. It couldn't pay its depositors. It was, effectively, a financial time bomb. Who pays when a bank like this fails? Here's where this stops being just a financial scandal and starts being your problem. Even if you've never heard of Brazil, like the United States, has a deposit guarantee system. In the US, it's the FDIC. In Brazil, it's called the FGC, the Fundo Garantidor de Créditos. This fund exists to protect everyday people who put their savings in a bank. If the bank fails, the fund pays them back, up to a limit. But here's the thing, that fund is not filled with government money. It's filled with contributions from all Brazilian banks, which means when Banco Master collapses, every other bank in Brazil has to chip in to cover the losses. And eventually, those costs get passed on to customers, to regular people. In other words, Daniel Vocaro, the man who ran Banco Master, didn't just steal from investors. According to prosecutors, he stole from every Brazilian who has a bank account. Who is Daniel Vocaro? Daniel Vocaro is the kind of person who, 5 years ago, almost nobody outside Brazilian financial circles had heard of. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a celebrity, he was a banker. But inside Banco Master, and inside a very specific circle of powerful people in Brasilia, Brazil's capital, Daniel Vocaro was one of the most connected men in the country. He was in his 40s, wealthy, charming, and from everything that has emerged in the investigation, absolutely obsessed with power. Not just money, power, the kind of power that makes judges call you back, the kind of power that makes problems disappear. The lifestyle, Andrea Bocelli, $18 million houses and no phones allowed. As investigators dug deeper, what they found reads like a scene from a Martin Scorsese film. Vocaro owned a mansion in Trancoso, one of Brazil's most exclusive beach destinations, a place where the Brazilian equivalent of the Hamptons meets a tropical paradise. The mansion was valued at approximately $18 million. He would throw parties at this mansion, parties that became infamous in certain circles. Authorities, judges, politicians, and businessmen would attend. But here's the detail that investigators found most interesting. Cell phones were strictly prohibited at these gatherings. No phones, no photos, no records. Brazilian federal police noted this detail in official documents and gave the location a nickname that stuck: Cine Trancoso, Trancoso Cinema. Because what happened there, apparently, was quite a show. There were also reports of Vocaro spending extraordinary amounts on personal gifts and events. At one point, he reportedly hired the legendary Italian tenor Andrea Bocelli to perform at a personal party, a party to propose to his girlfriend. Just for reference, a private Andrea Bocelli performance costs somewhere between $1 and $3 million. Where did that money come from? That's exactly what prosecutors want to know. The WhatsApp group called The Gang. When Brazilian federal police began analyzing Vocaro's phone and communication records, they found something extraordinary. He had a WhatsApp group. Investigators called it A Turma, the gang, and the members of that group were not random friends. They included some of the most powerful people in Brazilian politics, finance, and even the judiciary: ministers, judges, senators, executives. And in that group, according to leaked documents reviewed by multiple journalists, Vocaro didn't just socialize, he coordinated, he asked for favors. He made sure things went the right way. The federal police's conclusion was stark. Banco Master was not just a bank. It was a machine for purchasing influence at the highest levels of Brazilian power. The threat that shocked the country. But perhaps the detail that most shocked ordinary Brazilians was this. Among the messages recovered from Vocaro's devices, investigators found explicit threats against a journalist. Lauro Hadim is one of Brazil's most respected political reporters. Working for the newspaper O Globo, he had been investigating Banco Master and publishing stories that made Vocaro very uncomfortable. In private messages, Vocaro allegedly threatened to break Jardim's teeth. A direct physical threat against a journalist doing his job. It wasn't abstract, it wasn't symbolic, it was a threat. And what makes it even more disturbing is what came next. Those messages also allegedly went to, or involved, a very specific person. A person with the power to actually make problems. And journalists disappear. From law professor to Brazil's most feared man, Alexandre de Moraes is a Brazilian jurist, a legal scholar, a former state security secretary, and since 2017, a justice of Brazil's Supreme Court. He was appointed by then-President Michel Temer. In his early years on the court, he was relatively unremarkable. Another justice in a black robe. Then came 2018. Then came the political polarization. Then came Jair Bolsonaro's presidency, the rise of social media misinformation, and what Moraes and his allies described as a serious threat to Brazilian democracy. And Alexandre de Moraes transformed. The fake news inquiry. A judge who investigated his own cases. In 2019, Moraes opened what became known as the fake news inquiry. An investigation into what he described as organized groups spreading disinformation and attacking democratic institutions, specifically attacking Supreme Court justices. Now here's where legal experts across the political spectrum raised serious alarms. In Brazil's legal system, which follows an accusatorial model similar to the United States, a judge cannot open an investigation by himself. A judge decides cases. The prosecution investigates. These are separate, independent functions. For a reason. But Moraes opened this inquiry himself, without a prosecutor's request, without external authorization. He became simultaneously the investigator, the prosecutor, and the judge. To his supporters, this was necessary. The normal channels were too slow. Democracy was under attack and needed a guardian. To his critics, this was the definition of judicial authoritarianism. One man, with no oversight, deciding who gets investigated, who gets arrested, and what counts as a threat to democracy. The powers he accumulated. Over the following years, Moraes' power grew to extraordinary proportions. He ordered the arrest of prominent politicians and businessmen. He ordered Twitter, now called X, to block certain accounts in Brazil, and when X refused and was temporarily banned from the entire country, he froze bank accounts of people under investigation. He issued gag orders, search warrants, and surveillance authorizations at a pace that shocked legal observers. He appeared frequently on television. He gave interviews. He became, as one legal commentator put it, less like a Supreme Court justice and more like a combination of the FBI director, the Attorney General, and a cable news personality. and to a significant portion of the Brazilian population, particularly those who despised Bolsonaro and feared a return to authoritarianism. Moraes was a hero, the man who saved democracy. The moment everything changed, that narrative began to fracture when Banco Master collapsed. Because among the communications recovered from Daniel Vocaro's devices, investigators found something that, if true, changes everything about how we understand the last 5 years of Brazilian politics. Messages between Vocaro and Moraes, sent on the very day that Vocaro was being arrested, the day of the arrest. Let's set the scene. It's 2025. Brazilian federal police are executing an arrest warrant for Daniel Vocaro. He's being taken into custody. His world is collapsing around him. And in that moment, according to documents reviewed and reported by multiple Brazilian news organizations, Vocaro is sending messages. And some of those messages, according to investigators, went to Alexandre de Moraes. The content of those messages, as reported, included Vocaro asking Moraes whether he had managed to block something. Block what? Exactly. That detail remains under investigation, but the implication was explosive. A criminal suspect, on the day of his arrest, messaging the Supreme Court justice who oversees the case, allegedly asking if the justice had intervened on his behalf. Globo drops the bomb. The story was first published by O Globo, Brazil's largest and most influential media organization, roughly equivalent to the New York Times in terms of national influence and prestige. O Globo reported that the messages existed, that they had been forensically examined by the federal police, and that the analysis confirmed their authenticity. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was the only thing anyone in Brazil was talking about. Moraes responds and gets caught. Alexandre de Moraes issued a statement, a formal note released through the Supreme Court's official communications channels. In it, he said the messages were false, that there had been a technical examination, that the alleged exchange never happened, that this was an attack on him and on the institution of the Supreme Court itself. For a few hours, Brazil held its breath. Was Globo wrong? Did the federal police make a mistake? Was this a smear campaign? Then Globo came back. Within the same news cycle, O Globo released a second report, with new details, with new documentation, stating that the messages had not only been examined once, but that the forensic analysis had been peer-reviewed by multiple federal police units, and that the authentication was solid. In essence, Moraes had publicly denied the messages. The federal police's own forensic team had confirmed the messages were real, and Brazil found itself in an extraordinary situation. Either the country's most powerful media organization was fabricating federal police documents and engaging in a massive conspiracy against a Supreme Court justice, or a Supreme Court justice had just lied, publicly, on official letterhead, to the entire country. One of two people is lying. Legal commentators across Brazil converged on the same conclusion. There is no middle ground here. One of two parties is committing a serious crime. If Globo fabricated federal police documents, that is a criminal act, a fraud against the state. And Globo, one of the most commercially valuable media companies in Latin America, would have committed institutional suicide. If Moraes lied in an official statement released through the Supreme Court, that is not just a political problem. That is potentially obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and a violation of the very laws he was sworn to uphold. The legal community was stunned. The political community was stunned. And millions of ordinary Brazilians watching the news that evening were confronted with a question that had no comfortable answer. Who was really in charge of their country? The Lava Jato parallel that changes everything. Here's a detail that Brazilian legal experts kept returning to, and that Americans need to understand. In the early 2010s, Brazil had its own version of a massive corruption investigation, Operação Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. It brought down politicians, executives, and even a former president. It was celebrated internationally as proof that Brazil's institutions could hold the powerful accountable. But years later, that entire operation was annulled by the Supreme Court, largely because of evidence that the judge overseeing it had been communicating privately with the prosecutors. The judge and the prosecution were allegedly coordinating strategy. This was deemed a violation of due process. The man who led the effort to annul Lava Jato, Alexandre de Moraes. Now investigators were alleging that Moraes himself had been communicating privately with the defendant on the day of that defendant's arrest. The irony was not lost on anyone. The contract nobody can explain. The messages weren't the only thing connecting Alexandre de Moraes to Daniel Vocaro. Months before the messages became public, Brazilian investigative journalists had begun asking questions about a contract. A contract between a company connected to Volcaro and a company connected to Moraes' wife. The value of that contract, approximately 129 million Brazilian reais. At current exchange rates, that's roughly $24 to $28 million. For what services? That question has never been adequately answered. The contract exists, it has been documented. Moraes and his wife have never provided a public explanation of what services were rendered, why the amount was so large, or what connection it had, if any, to the cases Volcaro was involved in before Moraes. Moraes' own inquiry comes back to haunt him. Here's the particularly cruel irony of this detail. Alexandre de Moraes, through his fake news inquiry, had spent years investigating people for alleged corruption, disinformation, and abuse of power. People had their bank accounts frozen, had their homes raided, had their social media accounts blocked. Among the tools he used in those investigations was the COAF, Brazil's financial intelligence unit, and the Federal Revenue Service. These institutions can analyze anyone's financial transactions, follow the money trails, find the unexplained deposits. At one point, Moraes added both the COAF and the Federal Revenue Service to his fake news inquiry. At the time, legal experts questioned why financial intelligence agencies would be part of an investigation nominally about disinformation. Now, with the $28 million contract under scrutiny, some observers began to wonder whether Moraes had added those financial tools to his inquiry specifically to monitor and potentially suppress anyone investigating his own finances. The man who built the most powerful investigative apparatus in Brazilian legal history may have built it, at least in part, to protect himself. The location Trancoso is a small, extraordinarily exclusive village on the southern coast of Bahia, in northeastern Brazil. It is one of the most beautiful and most expensive to places in the country. Thatched roof boutique hotels, private beaches, restaurants that charge New York prices. The kind of place where Brazilian billionaires, foreign celebrities, and powerful politicians vacation far from the cameras. It is the perfect place to have conversations you don't want anyone to know about. The rules of Cine Trancoso. When Daniel Volcaro entertained at his Trancoso mansion, there were rules. Federal police documents reference multiple gatherings at this property, characterized by very specific conditions. No cell phones. Guests surrendered their devices upon arrival. Whatever happened inside, stayed inside. High-level attendees, the guest lists, according to investigative reporting and federal documents, included individuals from all three branches of government, executive branch officials, legislative figures, members of the judiciary, extraordinary luxury, private chefs, entertainment, exclusive wines, the kind of hospitality that, for a government official receiving it, could constitute a serious conflict of interest, or worse. Why the federal police called it institutional. In their official documentation, federal police investigators made a point of clarifying their perspective on these gatherings. They wrote, and this quote is remarkable, that the question is not moral, it is institutional. They weren't judging anyone's lifestyle choices. They were pointing out something far more serious, that these gatherings, based on their investigation, were not social events. They were business meetings. The business being conducted, the purchase of influence. When a banker hosting guests who are judges, ministers, and senators in a no-phone zone, and those same officials later make decisions that benefit the banker's institution, that is not a coincidence, that is a system. Brazil's oligarch problem. Throughout this investigation, Brazilian commentators kept reaching for a comparison that before 2025 would have seemed melodramatic. Russia's oligarchs. The Russian oligarchs, the billionaires who accumulated extraordinary wealth in the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse and maintained it through personal relationships with the Kremlin, have long been held up as the cautionary tale of what happens when business and state power become indistinguishable. What Banco Master's collapse revealed was the possibility that Brazil had developed its own version of this system. Not through decades of post-communist chaos, but through a quieter, more Brazilian kind of corruption, party by party, contract by contract, message by message. The man called the Hitman. As the Banco Master investigation expanded, it pulled in an extraordinary cast of characters. Among them was a man referred to in Brazilian media and court documents by the nickname Sicario, Portuguese for hitman or contract killer. He was not actually a hitman in the conventional sense. He was a fixer. An intermediary, someone who allegedly moved between criminal networks and powerful figures, carrying messages, facilitating connections, making sure certain things happened or didn't happen. He had been arrested in connection with the expanding investigation, the death while in custody, held in a federal police facility. This man allegedly attempted suicide. He was found, transported to a hospital in Belo Horizonte, and died. The federal police issued a statement saying that security cameras had captured the entire incident, that there were no blind spots in the footage, and that the images had been transmitted to the Supreme Court. Why people weren't satisfied in an ordinary country with an ordinary investigation, this might have been accepted at face value, but Brazil in 2025 was not ordinary, and this investigation was not ordinary. Immediately, comparisons emerged to Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier and convicted sex offender who died in a Manhattan federal jail in 2019 under circumstances that spawned enormous public skepticism, regardless of the official ruling of suicide. The public concern was simple. This man allegedly knew things, dangerous things, about powerful people, and now he was dead. The question that lingers. Brazilian legal commentators raised a point that is hard to dismiss. If the security footage exists and was transmitted to the Supreme Court, then Congress, through an investigative committee, should be able to request access to that footage. The public, through its elected representatives, should be able to verify what happened. Whether that verification will actually occur depends on whether the investigative committees that politicians are trying to establish actually get off the ground. Which brings us to the next piece of this puzzle, the extraordinary resistance to investigation. Why there's no investigation. Yet here is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire Banco Master scandal. Despite the scale of what has been alleged, despite the federal police investigation, despite the leaked documents, despite the media storm, as of mid-2025, there is still no functioning congressional investigative committee. Why not? Let's follow the obstruction. The CPMI roadblock. In Brazil's Congress, there is a mechanism called a CPMI, a Joint Parliamentary Investigative Commission involving both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. Under Brazilian law, once enough members of Congress sign a petition requesting one, the establishment of the CPMI is essentially automatic. Opposition lawmakers had gathered the required signatures. The petition had been filed, but it wasn't happening. And the reason was, the president of the National Congress, a politician named Arthur Lira's successor, Rodrigo Pacheco, and specifically, the Senate president, Arthur Lira, figures at the intersection of the Centrão, Brazil's term for the transactional, pragmatic political center that holds the balance of power, regardless of which party is in government. He was simply not scheduling the congressional session at which the CPMI would have to be officially read into the record and activated. No session, no CPMI. When confronted about this, he allegedly offered a deal. Drop the pressure for the Banco Master investigation, and he would schedule a vote on a different bill that the opposition wanted. In other words, he was using the investigation as a bargaining chip. One opposition deputy described his reaction to this offer in memorable terms. "You want me to trade my Ferrari for a bicycle with a flat tire? The Toffoli problem." Then there's Dias Toffoli, another Supreme Court justice who had been the original rapporteur, lead judge, on cases related to Banco Master. Toffoli, according to leaked recordings from a Supreme Court meeting, had been present when critical decisions were made about the bank. He had reportedly traveled on a private jet with lawyers representing Banco Master executives. He had imposed strict secrecy orders on portions of the case. When the Marias message scandal broke, Toffoli released a statement saying he had been unaware of the messages between Marias and Vocaro. Legal commentators immediately noted the problem. If Toffoli was the lead judge on the case and was genuinely unaware of messages between a defendant and a fellow justice, that meant either he was lying or he had been incompetently managing one of the most important financial fraud cases in Brazilian history. Neither option was good. The deeper pattern, what the Banco Master investigation revealed, was not just the corruption of specific individuals. It revealed a system. A system in which a relatively small bank, not one of Brazil's financial giants, could, allegedly, purchase access to the highest levels of government: judges, ministers, senators, executives of state-owned entities. If a mid-sized bank could do this, Brazilian legal commentators asked publicly, what could the country's organized crime networks do? What could the major drug trafficking factions, who have far more money than Banco Master ever had, accomplish with the same playbook? The question was not rhetorical. It was a warning, the 7-year silence. Here's something that Brazilian observers across the political spectrum, including critics of Alexandre de Moraes, have noted with some bewilderment. For approximately 7 years, from roughly 2018 to 2025, Brazil's mainstream media establishment, including O Globo, largely supported, or at minimum did not aggressively challenge, Alexandre de Moraes and the expanded powers of the Supreme Court. During this period, dozens of journalists, politicians, and media companies that were critical of the court faced various forms of pressure. Investigations, content removal orders, account suspensions. Brazil Paralelo itself was, according to its own account, censored in 2022. The major media organizations were largely quiet about these incidents, or, in some cases, supportive. Then, in 2025, Globo, the single most influential media company in Brazil, published the story that exploded Moraes' image. Globo didn't just report on Banco Master. Globo pursued it aggressively. Globo pushed back when Moraes denied the messages. Globo, in one news cycle, did more to challenge Moraes than 7 years of opposition media had managed. Why? Theory 1. The monster outgrew its creator. One analysis, offered by several Brazilian commentators. Globo and the broader media establishment had supported a strong Supreme Court as a counterweight to what they saw as the threat of Bolsonaro-era populism. They needed a guardian of democracy. Moraes was that guardian. But guardians have a tendency to accumulate power. And the Brazilian media establishment eventually looked at what Moraes had become, a single justice with investigative, prosecutorial, and judicial authority over vast swaths of Brazilian political and public life, and realized the cure might be worse than the disease. Bolsonaro's electoral defeat neutralized the original threat. The justification for an all-powerful judicial guardian no longer existed. And now, that guardian had become something that threatened even the institutions that had once supported him. Theory 2. Internal court politics. A second theory, less comfortable but widely discussed. Someone inside the Supreme Court, or very close to it, wanted Moraes removed, or at least diminished. Courts are not monoliths. They are political institutions filled with ambitious individuals who have their own alliances, rivalries, and agendas. The idea that a faction within the STF might have seen Banco Master as an opportunity to clean house, and that this faction might have quietly given journalists a green light to pursue the story, is not paranoid. It is how institutions work. One legal commentator put it this way: major media organizations in Brazil do not take on a sitting Supreme Court justice without some signal from inside those walls that the path is clear. What this means for democracy. Here's the uncomfortable conclusion. Whether the media turned because of genuine journalistic conviction, political calculation, or a nod from inside the court, the result is the same. In Brazil, press freedom has historically operated within the boundaries of what powerful institutions permit. The question of who investigates the investigators, who watches the watchers, remains unanswered. The fact that truth about Moraes' alleged conduct is now emerging is good. The fact that it took 7 years, and may have required internal court politics to make possible, is not. The two paths for Moraes, Alexandre de Moraes, now faces two parallel tracks of potential accountability. The first is political impeachment. Under the Brazilian Constitution, Supreme Court justices can be impeached. The process goes through the Senate, similar to how US federal judges can be impeached through Congress. In 140 years of the STF's existence, no justice has ever been successfully impeached, but multiple lawmakers have announced they are preparing formal impeachment requests. The second is criminal prosecution. If Moraes committed crimes, obstruction of justice, corruption, abuse of authority, he can, under the Constitution, be prosecuted. The case would be handled by his fellow justices on the Supreme Court, with the Federal Prosecutor's Office initiating charges. This has also never happened to a sitting justice in Brazilian history. The role of the Prosecutor General, Brazil's equivalent of the US Attorney General, is the Procurador-Geral da República, the PGR. The current PGR is Paulo Gonet, referred to colloquially in Brazilian political commentary as the Gonet. His role is critical. He is constitutionally responsible for supervising the Supreme Court justices and initiating criminal actions against them when warranted. Critics across the political spectrum have noted that Gonet has been, to put it diplomatically, extremely passive in exercising this function. He has been physically present alongside the justices at many public events. He has rarely, if ever, challenged their authority. If the Banco Master investigation is to result in criminal accountability for any justice, Gonet will need to act. Whether he will remains, as of this recording, very much an open question. The Andre Mendonça factor. There is one justice who has emerged as a genuinely independent figure in this drama. Andre Mendonça. He is the new rapporteur, lead judge, on the Banco Master cases, after Toffoli was removed. Mendonça has a background that makes him politically interesting. He was appointed by Jair Bolsonaro and is an evangelical Christian, two facts that made him deeply unpopular with the Brazilian left. He was confirmed to the court only after an extraordinary political battle, but in his handling of the Banco Master case, Mendonça has surprised observers. He has been methodical, transparent, and has prioritized restoring what one commentator called procedural integrity, essentially undoing the damage caused by Toffoli's management of the case and establishing a clean evidentiary record. He is also, by all accounts, extremely isolated inside the court. In an institution where social dynamics and coalition building matter enormously, the justice who is doing the most to advance accountability is the one with the fewest allies. The Brazil parallel. What this means for the world. Let's zoom out for a moment. Brazil is the world's fourth largest democracy. It is South America's dominant economy. It is a country of 215 million people with a growing middle class, a sophisticated civil society, and institutions that, for all their flaws, have historically been stronger than those of most of its neighbors. What the Banco Master scandal suggests is that those institutions are more fragile than anyone admitted. That the line between legitimate authority and oligarchic capture is not a wall, it is a door, and it can be opened by a banker with enough money and a WhatsApp group. The story of Alexandre de Moraes is not just a story about one powerful judge. It is a story about what happens when the institutions meant to protect democracy from concentrated power become, themselves, concentrations of power. It is a story about the difference between the appearance of accountability and the reality of it. And it is a story that is not over. Remember where we started. A judge secretly texting the criminal he was supposed to be prosecuting. On the day of that criminal's arrest, a wife with a $28 million contract that nobody can explain. A dead informant in a federal jail. A media company that spent 7 years looking the other way. And then, in a single news cycle, blew the whole thing open. And a country of 215 million people asking the question that no institution has yet been willing to answer. Who, exactly, has been in charge here? Brazil's democracy survived Getulio Vargas. It survived a 21-year military dictatorship. It survived hyperinflation, impeachments, and the chaos of the early 2000s. Whether it can survive the quiet corruption of its own guardians, that question is being answered, right now, in real time. And the answer matters not just for Brazilians. It matters for every democracy that has ever looked at its own institutions and assumed, without checking, that the people inside them were still working for everyone else. If you found this video valuable, share it with someone who thinks corruption only happens in other countries. Because the playbook Daniel Volcaro allegedly used, parties with no phones, contracts to the right spouses, WhatsApp groups with the right people, does not belong to Brazil alone. It belongs to power everywhere.